Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invite to speak at the African Jersey Forum. Today, I'm going to talk to you about dairy genetic improvement program design with a national approach lens on the talk. Next slide, please. So, going away from this talk today, I'd like you to go away with an understanding of why it is essential to have a genetic improvement program strategy. And I want to give you an example of what good looks like using an Irish industry example from the dairy industry. Next slide, please. Going into a little bit more detail, I want to share with you some concepts around the power of genetics, help you understand what a genetic improvement program strategy, improvement strategy is for, talk you through the importance of building a foundation, share with you what genomics can offer, and then the sort of value that can be created from having a national genetic improvement program in place. Next slide, please. So on the right-hand side here, you'll see a picture of 56-day-old chickens. In 1957, a 56-day-old chicken weighed about 905 grams. Fast forward 50 years or so, and that same chicken at the same age weighed about 4.2 kilos. And this really demonstrates the power of genetics. If you just push next slide, you should get some text up. So the reason genetics is powerful is that it leverages population performance and variation and combines that with selection to target multiple economic and environmental traits at the same time. Genomic technology has increased the speed of genetic change and also the value created, and I'll share with you an example of the sort of value created from genomics later in this talk. And genetics in the world we live in provides a very powerful tool to deliver food production, profit, and support progress towards net zero. Next slide, please. So this little diagram is a demonstration of why genetics is so powerful. So on the left-hand side there, we've got a picture of the cumulative and permanent nature of genetic improvement. So one of those little boxes is effectively 1 year of genetic change. So if we make genetic change for 10 years, you can see that they accumulate up. And because genetics is permanent, we get continual expression of those benefits over time. When you look on the right-hand side, you'll see fertilizer, where in a given year you might get some benefit, but then over the subsequent years, that benefit is utilized and you have to reapply to get benefits again. And it's really this cumulative and permanent nature of genetic improvement that allows it to be so powerful. Next slide, please. So to harvest the potential of genetics, to capture some of that cumulative and permanent benefit, we need a genetic improvement program strategy. So what do you need a strategy for? Next slide, please. You need a strategy to set the long-term direction of the industry and of the genetic improvement program. So the strategy includes aspects related to database and data infrastructure, and I'll share with you some examples from Ireland of how they transition from a certain database setup to something much more integrated and at a national level. Strategy covers stakeholder engagement, including involvement of stakeholders in the governance of the genetic improvement program, what traits have value, what, when, and how to record them. The key part that relates to the genetic and genomic evaluation, how to identify elite sires and the breeding schemes to do that, and that's where genomics comes in. And then, of course, in any strategy, you need to do some planning and understand how to roll it out, what it might cost, and also the context in which this program is supposed to function. Next slide, please. So if you look at this strategic or organized approach to genetic evaluation, by the textbook, it revolves around a central database, which I've written here as one version of the truth. So that's central to the functioning of a national genetic improvement program. Up the top there, you've got choose your breeding goal. So that's where the program starts. that's about picking what the industry wants to achieve from the genetic improvement program. Once that goal is defined, then the next step is to define the breeding objective. So that's defining what traits are going to add value to the industry. So in a dairy context, that includes things like milk production, animal health, longevity, fertility, and feed efficiency, for example. So once you've defined the value of the traits, then it's about recording information in animals, and that's the selection criteria. Once the recording is organized, it's about analyzing that data and identifying the elite animals. So that's your genetic evaluation system and the breeding scheme, and that's where genomics comes in. After you've identified the elite animals, then comes deployment of that elite genetic merit out into the industry so the benefits can be captured by farmers. And that's where we start thinking about technology like artificial insemination so that we can spread the genetics far and wide. And then the normal process is to do an economic analysis of the impact of the breeding program. And then on the basis of that economic analysis, revisit the breeding goal and decide whether the industry is going in the right direction. And I've got an example of an economic analysis of the Irish dairy industry coming up to demonstrate the kind of scale of impact that can be created. Next slide, please. So those are the components of a genetic improvement program. The reality is that they never really happen in that kind of sequenced order, but all of the key components are essential to making it work. Sometimes there's an opportunity to build on a green field where there's no infrastructure in place, and that provides a great opportunity to design something perfect from the beginning. Next slide, please. But often things are not green field, and here's an example from the Irish industry of the data and performance recording infrastructure that was in place in the 1990s. So the first thing you can see down the left-hand side there is a whole lot of different databases which have some connections between them, and each of those databases is held by a service provider. So milk recording, herd books, meat factories, and calf registrations and whatnot are all there as independent service providers to farmers, and they provide services to the dairy and beef herds, and they get data back, and they provide information as well. But there's clearly not one version of the truth here. There's not one central database to underpin the genetic evaluation. So what the Irish industry did was they developed the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, where they reorganised this, and a picture of that is on the next slide, please. So here we have a reorganisation of the genetic evaluation and genetic improvement infrastructure at the national level. So you can see right in the middle there the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation database, where all of the service providers put their data into that one database. Some of the service providers get information back and then subsequently provide services back to farmers. So we have a rearrangement of the core element of a national breeding program to have one version of the truth in a central database. And this is really a key concept to any national efforts to produce a genetic evaluation system, is that there's one version of the truth and that there's one database that underpins the genetic evaluation. Next slide, please. So with a national database in place with one version of the truth, an important aspect of a genetic improvement program is a breeding scheme. So breeding schemes are designed to identify the most elite individuals in the population. And the contemporary technology to do this is genomics. So next slide, please. So genomics works by building what's called a reference population. So the reference population is a group of animals in industry or designed by the genetic improvement program to have a bunch of phenotypes for important traits. Usually hard to measure or very expensive traits are recorded in reference populations. and those animals also have a genotype taken. So then the combination of those phenotypic measurements and genotypes means that a genomic evaluation can be done, and that genomic evaluation is able to provide estimates of genetic merit for animals that have genotypes only. So potential selection candidates. So in a dairy context, young bulls where they don't have a phenotype yet, or they haven't had daughters to have a milking phenotype, but they have a genotype, and that reference population of animals with genotypes and phenotypes can be leveraged to produce an estimate of genetic merit for those selection candidates. Next slide, please. So genomics is a key tool in the genetic improvement toolbox, but it's important that one considers the phenotypes required when trying to deploy genomic selection. So this graph shows the estimated accuracy of genomic selection in genotype selection candidates on the y-axis, dependent on the number of animals with genotypes and phenotypes in the reference population on the x-axis. And so there's 3 lines on there. So at one extreme, we've got a line with a heritability of 0.1, so that's the bottom line. And you can see that to get an accuracy of prediction in selection candidates of 60%, about 10,500 animals are needed with genotypes and phenotypes in the reference population. For a trait with a heritability of 0.3, so significantly more heritable, only 3,500 animals with genotypes and phenotypes are needed in the reference population to get a genomic prediction accuracy of 0.6 or 60% in the genotype selection candidates. So the important thing here to note is that in the world of genomics, phenotypes are essentially important, and they're a key part of the development of a breeding scheme and should not be forgotten in building a national breeding program. Next slide, please. So just to demonstrate the sort of value that that genomics can create. So this is the Irish dairy industry again, where on the left-hand axis there you can see profit in the National Selection Index, so the National Economic Selection Index for dairy cattle in Ireland. And you can see some lines on that graph which demonstrate different periods. So to the left of the green dotted line between 2002 and 2008, that was the Irish dairy industry when there was no genomics. And the genetic trend in that blue line there is delivering about $8.50 of profit per cow per year. If you then shift to the right-hand side of that dotted line where the blue genetic trend increases rapidly, that's the genomics era. So between 2009 and 2022, the rate of genetic gain was delivering $13 of profit per cow per year, which is a 50% increase in profit to the farmer as a result of genomics. So there's significant value to be gained through a national program which can deploy genomics at scale. Next slide, please. But what sort of value can be created overall? So we've got lots of value created by genomics. We've got a key one version of the Truth database as the central pillar of this genetic improvement program. So what sort of benefits can accrue to farmers? Next slide, please. So I showed you earlier on a diagram which demonstrated that genetics is cumulative and permanent. So what we do is we say historically how much benefit has been gained from genetic improvement, in this case in the Irish dairy industry. So you can see between 2003 and 2017, there's kind of an accumulation of genetic merit over that time. And if we apply that methodology of accumulating the benefits over that period, the benefits accumulate to about 1.65 billion US dollars. That's a very big number. The industry in Ireland is about 1.2 million dairy cows. And so when you boil that down to an annual value per dairy cow, the historic benefits of genetic improvement at the national level have delivered about $90 per dairy cow per year over the 2003 to 2017 period. So that's a big amount of money. If you go to the next slide, I'll demonstrate the permanent benefits that accrue because of that. So you can see there on that chart the $1.65 billion that genetic improvement created between 2003 and 2017. So we've accumulated that. If we then apply the fact that that improvement is permanent, if you go next slide, you'll see that the permanent nature of that historic genetic improvement means that there's another $4.4 billion on the table from 2018 to 2040 over the next sort of 20 years as a result of historic genetic improvement. If we then go next slide, please, you'll see that if we sustain the current rate of genetic improvement for 10 more years and assume that we get permanent benefits for another 10 years, then that adds an additional $3.63 billion to the Irish economy as a result of a national genetic improvement program. So very big numbers there and very big value from an organised structure at the national level to deliver a database which has got one version of the truth and some very good breeding schemes around that to identify the high merit individuals using genomics to the benefit of Irish dairy farmers. Next slide, please. Of course, I've been talking to you about the Irish dairy industry, and that's very different from the African dairy industry or dairy industries in African nations. So context is very important. So we've seen some really big numbers there in Ireland, but the scale of production obviously impacts the scale of value. So that needs to be taken into account when considering what might be available in terms of benefits to dairy farmers in Africa. Something else to consider is how to engage so many producer stakeholders so that the genetic improvement program delivers value to them. Of course, you saw the picture of the database there and all the data flowing into that national database in Ireland. There are some logistics challenges in generating lots of data in small-scale producer industries, and so that needs to be taken into account when designing a national breeding scheme. There's also the cost of genomics relative to the value of the animal. So genomics requires some spending to generate that genotype. And depending on the value of the animal based on its milk production or its intrinsic value to the farmer, that genomics cost can be quite high. So we would need to, in a national breeding program, we would need to consider the cost of genomics relative to the value of the animal. And then, of course, there's the infrastructure required to disseminate the genetic merit. So if any country is going to invest in building a scheme or a national genetic improvement program to deliver benefits, then the infrastructure needs to be in place to make sure that those benefits are realised by farmers. And that requires genetic merit to be spread using things like routine artificial insemination. Next slide, please. So I hope I've given you a flavour of the power of genetics, what it takes to build a national infrastructure for genetic improvement. The take-home messages from this talk are that there are formal processes to build, collective and national genetic improvement programs. It can't be done in an ad hoc way. A strategy is required to deliver that. Things don't usually happen by the textbook, and that's okay, but it's important to note that all of the building blocks are essential. So for it to function and deliver maximum value, all of those components need to be in place. A central data infrastructure and one version of the truth will underpin success. So without data, genetics doesn't work. And so having one source of the truth and some central infrastructure to manage the data is really important. All stakeholders must be involved for something like this to work. And I've put there including in governance. So if there's going to be some sort of national infrastructure put together, then all members of the supply chain, or representatives from all members of the supply chain, should be included in the governance of that organisation, because ultimately it should be for the benefit of everybody. Genomics offers big value, but only if you truly understand the value of phenotype and the relationship between phenotype and genotype in building that breeding scheme. And of course, a formal national genetic improvement strategy offers huge value if indeed the context for rollout and adoption are considered, and so that it delivers value to the whole industry. Thank you very much, and look forward to questions. Next slide, please.